Hi, I'm Luna. I'll tell my story. The loudest sound I have ever heard was the click of my front door closing. It wasn't a slam. It was soft, final, and utterly precise. The sound of a key turning twice in the lock from the outside. The sound of a chapter ending. The sound of my husband, David, leaving me. I don't know how long I stood there in the hallway, frozen. The apartment we had chosen together, painted together, filled with dreams together, was suddenly a museum of a life that was over. Every object was a hitbit labeled before. The gray sofa we found at the flea market, the bookshelf we built together that still leans slightly to the left, the photograph of us laughing on a beach, our faces smudged with sunlight. It all felt like it belonged to someone else. My legs gave out, and I slid down the wall onto the cold hardwood floor, pulling my knees to my chest. The silence was a physical weight on my skin. This was the silence after the storm. His words with a storm. "I'm so sorry, Luna. I never meant for this to happen. It's just, Sarah, she understands me. We want the same things." Sarah. Her name was a drop of acid. She was a colleague from his office. I'd met her at a Christmas party. She had a bright, easy laugh and wore a green dress. I remember feeling a tiny, stupid pang of insecurity that night, a cold trickle of fear that I brushed away because I trusted him. I trusted us. How foolish that seems now. The tears came then, not in sobs, but in a silent, relentless river that soaked the collar of my shirt. This was more than a heartbreak. This was an annihilation. David wasn't just my husband. He was my best friend, my home. After a childhood where I always felt like I was too sensitive, too much for my own pragmatic family, he was the one who made me feel seen. He made my intensity feel like a superpower, not a flaw. And now he was gone. He had looked at all that I was and decided it was not enough. The numbness returned as the tears dried up. Hours bled into each other. The city lights outside the window blurred into a meaningless watercolor of neon. I was a ghost in my own home. My gaze eventually drifted across the room and landed on my laptop, sitting dark on the coffee table, a lifeline to a world outside this suffocating silence. With a strength I didn't know I had, I pushed myself up and walked over to it. I didn't open his social media. I didn't torture myself with questions. I opened a blank document. The cursor blinked on the white screen, a tiny, persistent heartbeat in the void. And then I began to write. The words didn't feel like my own. They felt ripped from a raw, open place deep inside me. They were sharp, fragmented, and true. I wrote about the taste of betrayal, the hollow echo in a room that once held laughter, the terrifying feeling of becoming invisible in the one place you should be most seen. I didn't think. I just let it flow. When I finished, my hands were trembling. At the top of the page, I typed a title, "The Geometry of a Goodbye." And then I created a new blog. For the name, I typed the first thing that came into my head, a phrase that felt like a desperate, hopeful prayer. Scars to stars. I pasted the poem. I didn't edit it. I didn't second guess it. My finger hovered over the trackpad, right over the publish button. This was the most vulnerable thing I had ever done, to take the shattered pieces of my heart and offer them up to the anonymous void of the internet. I took a shaky breath, and I clicked. The screen refreshed. My pain was now public. It was a message in a bottle thrown into a vast digital ocean. I had no idea if anyone would ever find it. But in that moment, as I sat alone in the devastating silence, I felt the faintest, tiniest spark of something I hadn't felt in weeks. Tea. It was the spark of release. I had spoken my truth. And for the first time since the door clicked shut, I was no longer just David's ex-wife. I was Luna, and I had something to say. The crushing silence of the apartment began to morph. It was no longer just an empty space where David's laughter used to be. It became a cocoon, and inside it, the only sound was the relentless tap, tap, tapping of my keyboard. Scars to Stars was no longer just a blog. It was my confession booth, my battlefield, and my sanctuary, all rolled into one. I wrote with a fever I didn't know I possessed. The poems were raw, unedited nerves spilled onto the digital page. I wrote about finding a long blonde hair on his pillow that wasn't mine. I wrote about the specific brand of emptiness that comes from cooking for one. I gave my pain a title, a structure, a rhythm. It was my way of trying to control the uncontrollable. I never expected an answer. I was screaming into a void, and the echo of my own keys was enough. So when the first notification appeared, a tiny glowing number next to the word comments, my breath hitched. It felt like a violation and an invitation all at once. With a trembling hand, I clicked. I found this at 3 a.m. I thought I was the only one who felt this. Hollow. Thank you for giving it a name. A stranger's words, typed from somewhere across the city, or maybe across the world, traveled through the Guangsen and cables and found me. They didn't erase the pain, but they cradled it. They made it shared. More comments followed. Each, "This is exactly how I feel," was a stitch pulling my fractured pieces closer together. My isolation, once a prison, became a strange, silent commune of the brokenhearted. I was still Luna, the woman who was left. But I was also Scars to Stars, the anonymous voice who could translate agony into verse. The first identity was a wound. The second was beginning to feel like a purpose. Behind the veil, I was not defined by his abandonment. I was defined by my survival of it. And with every published poem, that survival felt a little more like strength. The comments became my oxygen. Each notification was a tiny pulse of validation, a digital whisper saying, "You are not alone." I started to recognize usernames: Broken Blueprint, Searching for Sunlight, Midnight Reader. They were my silent companions in the long, hollow nights. We were a constellation of fractured hearts, glowing faintly for each other across the infinite dark. I began to write for them. My poems shifted, almost imperceptibly. They were still carved from my own raw pain, but now I wrote with the awareness of their eyes. I wasn't just screaming into the void. I was describing the void's topography so others could navigate it. The act of writing became less about my own release and more about building a lighthouse. It was Midnight Reader who unknowingly pulled the pin on the grenade inside me. Their comment was under a poem about the particular sting of a forgotten anniversary. This cuts so deep. It makes me wonder, did your family also make you feel this small? Like your love was a burden? For me, that's the old wound he managed to reopen. I read the words, then I read them again. The air left my lungs in a sudden, painful rush. It was like a key turning in a lock I didn't know existed. David's betrayal wasn't a standalone catastrophe. It was a perfect, devastating strike on the weakest part of my foundation. The feeling of being too much. The certainty of my own inherent lack. Memories I'd buried for years surged forward, vivid and cruel. My father's weary sigh when I'd cry as a child. "Don't be so dramatic, Luna." My mother's tight smile when I'd show her a drawing. "That's nice, dear. Maybe be quieter now." They hadn't been malicious, just indifferent. They wanted a quiet, easy daughter, and they'd gotten a storm of feelings they couldn't understand. They loved me, but conditionally, and I had learned, deep in my bones, that to be loved, David had been the opposite. He'd seemed to delight in my intensity, in the very parts of me my family dismissed. He'd called me his brilliant, passionate Luna. I thought he'd seen me. I thought he was the answer. But he wasn't. He was just a more sophisticated version of the same rejection. He had taken the parts of me my family found inconvenient and weaponized them. My passion became exhausting. My need for deep connection became clingy. He hadn't loved the real me. He had loved the idea of a woman he could eventually trim to fit his life. And when I didn't, when I remained stubbornly, authentically too much, he found someone who was less. A realization didn't set me free. It shattered me. The pain was no longer just about a man. It was about a lifetime of being told, in 1,000 subtle ways, that I was fundamentally unlovable. I closed the laptop. The screen went black, and in its dark reflection, I didn't see a budding poet. I saw a lonely little girl, forever on the outside, desperately pressing her face against the glass. The digital lighthouse had gone dark. I was lost at sea again, and this time, the storm was inside me. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the empty silence of David's absence or the comforting quiet of my writing cocoon. This was a heavy, suffocating silence, filled with the echoes of my own perceived inadequacy. I was the lonely little girl and the abandoned woman, and the space between those two truths felt infinite and impossible to bridge. For days, I didn't write. I didn't open the laptop. The thought of those kind, understanding comments now felt like a lie. They thought I was strong. They didn't know I was just a cracked vessel, leaking a lifetime of neediness. I was exactly what David and my family had always seen, a burden. But a strange thing happened in that silence. The pain, having been named and recognized, began to lose its amorphous, terrifying power. It was no longer a monster lurking in the shadows of my mind. It was a collection of specific, hurtful moments, and a collection of things can be examined. It can be sorted. A memory surfaced, clear and sharp. I was 10, and I had written a short story for school. A fantastical tale about a girl who could talk to stars. I was so proud. I'd handed it to my mother, my heart bursting. She'd skimmed it, placed it on the counter, and said, "That's very creative, darling. Now, shouldn't you be focusing on your maths homework? That's what will really get you somewhere." The old shame washed over me, but this time, I didn't let it pull me under. I looked at that memory from my adult eyes. I saw a bright, imaginative child, and I saw a parent who was too pragmatic to see the magic in front of her. For the first time, a new, fragile thought emerged. Her reaction wasn't about the value of my story. It was about her own limitations. It was a tiny crack in the dam. Tentatively, I opened my laptop. The screen blazed to life, filled with notifications. Worried messages from my regular commentators asked if I was okay. They missed my words. They missed my words. My cursor hovered over the new post button. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But beneath it was something else, a faint, stubborn spark of defiance. I didn't write a poem about David. I didn't write a poem about my parents. I wrote a poem for that 10-year-old girl. I wrote about the weight of a dismissed dream. I wrote about the lonely, brilliant constellation of imagination that no one else could see. I wrote it not for the audience, but for her. For me. I titled it, "For the Girl Who Talked to Stars." I clicked publish. My heart hammered, not with fear of judgment, but with the terrifying vulnerability of speaking a deeper, older truth. The first comment came from Broken Blueprint. This one reached a place deep inside me I didn't even know was still hurting. "Thank you for seeing her. It makes it easier for me to see mine." I read the words and finally, truly understood. I wasn't just building a lighthouse for others. We were all building it together, each of us adding our own light, our own story to keep the great dark at bay. My sensitivity wasn't a flaw. It was the instrument. My pain wasn't a burden. It was the map. The crack in the dam widened. A thread of light, fragile but unbreakable, had been spun in the darkness. I was still cracked, but I was no longer leaking. I was beginning to heal. The thread of light I had found was fragile, but it held. Writing for the girl who talked to stars had unlocked a new language, one that spoke of older wounds and quieter shames. My blog became an excavation site. With each poem, I dug deeper, unearthing memories I'd packed away in the name of survival. The response was overwhelming. My digital commune held its breath with me, urging me on with their own stories of childhood ghosts. But you cannot dismantle your foundation without expecting tremors. The newfound clarity was intoxicating, but it made the present-day reality of my life feel increasingly surreal. I was living in a museum of a marriage, surrounded by the artifacts of before. David's side of the closet still held a few forgotten shirts. The coffee maker was the one we'd bought together. Every object felt like an accusation, a reminder of the life that was supposed to be. The breaking point was a can of shaving cream. I found it at the back of the bathroom cabinet, a cheap brand David used when he was in a hurry. He'd left it behind. I held the cold, familiar canister in my hand, and it wasn't just shaving cream. It was the ghost of 1,000 mundane mornings, the echo of a man who had chosen to leave. The dam of composure I'd so carefully built shattered. A raw, guttural sound tore from my throat. I didn't cry, I screamed. I screamed at the can, at the apartment, at the unfairness of it all. I grabbed it and hurled it against the shower wall. The impact was pathetic, unsatisfying. The rage consumed me. I yanked his remaining shirts from the hangers and threw them into a heap on the floor. I was a tornado in a tiny, tastefully decorated hell, destroying the relics of a faith I no longer believed in. When the energy left me, I collapsed onto the pile of clothes, sobbing, the scent of his cologne rising from the fabric like a poison. This wasn't the quiet grief of Chapter 1. This was furious, unhinged, primal mourning. I wasn't just sad. I was enraged at the time I'd wasted, the love I'd misplaced, the person I'd contorted myself into. Exhausted, I crawled to my laptop. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely type. I didn't craft a poem. I wrote a raw, unpunctuated stream of consciousness. I wrote about the shaving cream. I wrote about the fury. I wrote about the terrifying fear that this pain would never end, that I would be forever defined by his leaving. I titled it with one word, Unraveled. I posted it and shut the laptop, expecting to be met with silence. This wasn't the inspiring, hopeful stuff of healing. This was the ugly, messy truth of it. The next morning, I opened my blog with trepidation. The comment section wasn't silent. It was overflowing. The top comment was from Searching for Sunlight. Thank you for this. Thank you for the rage. I'm still so busy being sad. I forgot I was allowed to be angry. This is the real work. Another from Midnight Reader. I trashed my ex's favorite mug after reading this. It felt incredible. We see you, Luna. And we're unraveling right here with you. They weren't scared off by my chaos. They were embracing it. They were in the trenches with me. My unraveling wasn't a failure. It was a catalyst. In showing them my broken pieces, I gave them permission to show theirs. My vulnerability wasn't a weakness. It was the knot that tied us all together, stronger than before. The storm had passed, and I was still here. We all were. The aftermath of the unraveling was a strange, quiet peace. The storm had passed, and in its wake, I wasn't destroyed. I was cleansed. The apartment, once a shrine to a ghost, was now just a space. My space. I bagged up David's clothes and donated them. I threw out the shaving cream. Each item I let go of felt like a stone removed from my pocket, making me lighter. My blog was buzzing, a constant warm hum of shared experience. But a new, quiet knowing began to grow in me, a seed planted deep during my rage. Scars to Stars was no longer a hiding place. It was my truth. And truths, real truths, deserve to be owned. The email arrived on a Tuesday. The subject line was simple: Query, Scars to Stars publication. My heart stopped. It was from a small, respected indie publisher. The editor, a woman named Clara, wrote that she'd been following the blog for weeks. She didn't offer pity, she offered recognition. Your words, she wrote, are a lifeline. They are art. We would be honored to help you make them into a book. A book. My words in a book. The old Luna, the one who lived in the shadow of others' approval, would have immediately thought of David. Would he see it? What would he think? The new Luna, the one who had screamed her throat raw and been met with love, felt something else entirely, a calm, steady certainty. This was my choice, my story. I wrote back to Clara, my fingers steady on the keys. I said yes. And then I took the most terrifying step of all. In a new blog post, I didn't publish a poem. I published a letter. To my fellow travelers, it began. For months, we have met here in the dark, knowing each other only by our wounds and our words. You have been my salvation. You have taught me that our scars are not things to be hidden. They are proof that we survived the battle. I took a deep breath, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. My name is Luna, and I am signing a contract to turn our shared journey into a book titled Scars to Stars. This is my story. Thank you for helping me find the courage to claim it. I attached a simple, recent photo of myself, just me, smiling softly, my eyes holding the camera gently. No filter, no hiding. I hit publish. The silence that followed was electric. I half expected the world to end. Instead, my phone buzzed, then buzzed again, and again. Not with notifications from the blog, but with text messages. First, from my friend Maya. Luna, a book? I'm screaming, so proud of you. Also, your blog is incredible. Why didn't you tell me? Then from a college friend. Just saw your post. Wow, just wow. You're amazing. The digital veil was gone. Scars to Stars was no longer an anonymous secret. It was a part of me, integrated into my real life. The support wasn't just from my online community, it was from my world. And then an email appeared in my personal inbox. The sender, David. The subject line, your book. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I opened it. Luna, I heard about the book. Congrats, I guess. That's a big deal. I always knew you were talented. It was so perfectly, painfully him. Non-committal, vaguely patronizing, entirely centered on his own perception. The old me would have dissected that email for days, searching for crumbs of validation. The new me read it once, felt the brief sting of his inability to simply say, I'm happy for you. And then I did something I never thought I'd have the strength to do. I selected the email. My finger hovered over the delete key for just a second. Not in rage, but in absolute quiet finality. I clicked it. It vanished from my screen and from my life. I wasn't Luna, the woman David left. I was Luna, the author, the truth teller. I had claimed my name, my story, and my power. And no one could ever take it from me again. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of edits, cover designs, and a quiet, humming excitement I had never known before. It was a productive buzz, so different from the anxious static that had filled me for months. I was building something. The book, titled Scars to Stars, was taking shape, a tangible artifact of my journey. The launch was set for a small, independent bookstore downtown. As the day approached, the old fears tried to whisper. What if no one comes? What if they think you're a fraud? But they were faint echoes now, easily drowned out by the steady rhythm of my new certainty. The night of the event, I stood before my closet not with dread, but with intention. I chose a simple emerald green dress, a color that felt like growth, like life. I looked in the mirror and didn't see a victim or a survivor. I saw an author. Walking into the bookstore was like walking into a dream. Chairs were set up, and to my astonishment, they were almost all filled. But it was the faces that stole my breath. There was Maya, beaming, giving me a thumbs up. There were colleagues I hadn't seen since I'd left my old job. And then I saw them, a small group of people sitting together near the back. A woman with kind, anxious eyes caught my gaze and offered a small, tentative wave. Next to her, a man nodded slowly, his expression one of deep understanding. I didn't know their names, but I knew their souls. Broken Blueprint, Midnight Reader, Searching for Sunlight. They had come. My digital commune had manifested in the physical world. My throat tightened with a gratitude so profound it felt like pain. They had come to see me. The store owner introduced me. As I walked to the small podium, a hush fell over the room. The spotlight was warm on my skin. I looked out at the expectant faces, my community woven together from different parts of my life, and my nerves melted away. "Thank you for coming," I began, my voice clear and steady. "This book, it started as a scream into the void. It became a conversation. And tonight, it feels like a celebration. Not of pain, but of the light we find in each other." I read a poem about the shaving cream. I read one for the girl who talked to stars. I read Unraveled. As I read, I saw heads nod. I saw tears wiped away, not in sadness, but in recognition. I was not just telling my story. I was telling our story. During the Q&A, a woman stood up. It was Searching for Sunlight. "I followed your blog from the beginning," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "You gave words to my pain when I had none. Watching you stand here tonight, it makes me believe I can stand somewhere too, one day. Thank you." I could barely whisper "thank you" back through my own emotion. After the reading, I was signing books, my hand cramping in the best possible way. I looked up to see the next person in line, and my heart stuttered. It was my mother, and next to her, my father. They looked older, smaller than I remembered. My mother's hands were clasped tightly in front of her. There was no blame in their eyes, only a hesitant, uncertain pride, and a deep, unmistakable regret. "Luna," my mother said, her voice soft, "your poems, they are so beautiful and so sad." She paused, struggling for words. We never knew. We never meant to make you feel you had to hide." My father simply nodded, his eyes glistening. "We're proud of you, honey." It wasn't a perfect apology. It wasn't a magic fix for the past. But it was an acknowledgement, a beginning. For the first time, they were seeing me not as a reflection of their expectations, but as a whole person, with a story of my own. I reached out and took my mother's hand. It felt fragile in mine. "Thank you for coming," I said, and I meant it. I signed a book for them, writing inside, "For Mom and Dad. All my love, Luna." As they moved away, I looked around the bustling bookstore. At my friends laughing, at my readers clutching their books to their chests like treasures, at my parents watching me from a distance. The different worlds of my life had collided, and instead of breaking apart, they had formed a new, beautiful constellation. The reading was over. The healing, I realized, was just beginning. Time, I learned, doesn't heal all wounds, but it does give you the tools to build a new life around them. The raw, open nerve of David's betrayal had calloused over, not into something numb, but into something resilient. The pain was no longer a scream. It was a footnote in my history. I moved out of the apartment. It was no longer a place of healing, but a relic. I found a smaller place, a sunlit studio with large windows that overlooked a quiet park. The first thing I unpacked was my books. The second was a framed copy of the first page of my manuscript. This space was mine alone, from the first brushstroke of paint to the placement of every piece of furniture. It smelled of fresh coffee and possibility. One evening, about a year after the book launch, I was standing at my window, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. My phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Clara, my editor, about a new printing. A translation offer from a German publisher. The world was gently, persistently expanding. I caught my reflection in the glass. The woman looking back was familiar, yet entirely new. There were fine lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, but her gaze was steadier, softer. Without thinking, my fingers went to my temple, tracing the faint, silvery line of a scar I'd had since childhood. I used to hate it, to hide it under my hair. Now, I saw it differently. It was a part of my map, just like the deeper, invisible scars David and my past had left. They weren't flaws to be concealed. They were proof. Proof that I had felt deeply, loved recklessly, fallen completely, and somehow, impossibly, gotten back up. They were not wounds. They were constellations. Each scar told a story. The childhood one, a tale of a brave, clumsy girl. The one on my heart from David, a story of naivety, but also of immense courage to have loved so openly. The ones from my family, a story of learning to find validation within. I had spent a lifetime seeing myself as a collection of broken pieces, but that night I saw the truth. I was not broken. I was whole. And my scars were the golden seams that held me together, more beautiful for having been repaired. A profound peace settled over me, a quiet knowing that radiated from my core. This was what it meant to be complete. Not the absence of pain, but the integration of it. Not in spite of my history, but because of it. The journey from then to now hadn't been a straight line. It was a spiral. I had returned to the same places of pain, but each time from a higher perspective, with a new understanding. I had navigated by the stars of my own making. I was no longer Luna, the woman who was left. I was no longer Scars to Stars, the anonymous blogger. I was simply Luna, whole, author, creator. And my light, once a flicker in a vast, overwhelming dark, now shone with a steady, unbreakable glow. I had not just found the stars. I had become one.